Modern History at Staffordshire University. He focuses on the modern history of Russia and Central Asia. He's interested in themes of state building, nomadism, imperialism, decolonization. His monograph, Nomads in Early Soviet Central Asia, came out in 2019. It just got the BASIS book award, Alexander Novy Award, that was announced yesterday. And he's going to talk a little bit about that as well. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll attempt to share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint okay, I hope. Now.
Yeah, it's all good. Thank you.
Okay. I should say that I won the Alexander Novy Prize the previous year for 2018, but I did indeed win that prize. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the talk. I'm really appreciative of the chance to talk a little bit about my research today. As you've just heard, my name's Alan. Thanks especially to Projecti for inviting me. I'll just start by saying just very, very broadly that what I'm going to do for the next 45 to 50 minutes is talk about the treatment of nomadic peoples in Central Asia by the Communist Party in the first full decade of Soviet power. And I'm going to draw case studies in particular from the Kazakh Soviet Republic as it was at the time, and the Kyrgyz Soviet Republic as it became towards the end of the 1920s. So principally that my findings apply to those two places. There's an alternative universe, an alternative reality really, where I'm currently giving a paper on more recent findings that I've made in regional archives in Kyrgyzstan. I was due to fly to Bishkek late March last year. Unfortunately, that reality obviously is one without COVID. So I'm drawing principally on stuff I've already done. That's despite having fought tooth and nail for the funding and the time to do the research last year, but I'm not bitter. So towards the end of the talk, I'll focus a little bit on what I'm hoping to do next in my research, if indeed we ever get the chance again to travel. And I'll be keen to hear your thoughts, especially on my next steps and whether you think that the next research project is feasible, but I'll come to that right at the end. I'm going to talk, as I've said, about the treatment of nomads by the Communist Party, but I'm also going to talk about their reaction to that treatment. And I'll move from 1920-ish to about 1929-ish, but we'll cover the collectivization campaign briefly at the end too, because that's a critical part of the story, which I don't focus on, but I feel like I must include. So we're principally focusing therefore on the years of the new economic policy in Soviet history, the NEP era. I very much came to Central Asia from a background in modern Russian and Soviet history. My first publication was actually on the Gulag system in Siberia. So Central Asia became an interest during my doctoral studies, and initially I was going to focus on questions of identity and language reform. But then I started to really think about the existence and experience of nomads in the early Soviet Union, and that's been my interest henceforth. So what I'll do first of all is just talk a little bit about how the book developed as it was published in 2018 and what its kind of central ideas were originally. I'll also talk a little bit about the conceptual assumptions I made and trying to talk about how we define nomadism in the context of this study. Very conscious of speaking to a principally Central Asianist audience today, whereas normally I probably find myself talking to people who are interested perhaps in Russian or Soviet history. So I think it's worthwhile unpacking some of that as well. Then I'll outline some of my findings. These are roughly that the Communist Party approached the government of Central Asia with three major kind of salient preoccupations in mind. As far as nomads were concerned. The first preoccupation was class, economic class. The second was nationhood and national identity. And the third was economic development and productivity. And I'm going to argue that nomadism and nomadic peoples didn't really sit nicely with any of those three kind of agendas for communist rule. This means that Communist Party governance was never likely to be beneficial for nomads or particularly accommodating, but this is different from saying that the relationship was always going to be antagonistic. I think there's small signs that a different relationship was possible. The implications of this argument in turn are that ultimately the fatal effect communism had on nomadism in the early 1930s is not entirely, but primarily contingent upon not local conditions and local politics, but on the all-union political changes going on in Moscow in the late 1920s, the Cultural Revolution or the Counter-Revolution, Stalinism, 5-year plans, all that stuff. Finally, I'll say a few words, as I've said, about how I tried to summarize my findings and place them in a conceptual framework. And I'll argue that the 1920s in Soviet Central Asia can, for this subject at least, be understood as a post-colonial moment or a post-colonial space. So the origins of the project, initially, nomadism just plus communism just struck me as quite an interesting clash. And when I first envisaged the project, I thought the study would revolve around the Communist Party's particular vision for economic development and how that was confounded by nomadism. And there is some of that, but there are additional nuances that cropped up when I actually did the research. I felt I saw a small place in the broader history in which I could insert this study. One of the things I saw early on in my doctoral research is something of a paradox in historiography of the early Soviet period in Central Asia. Namely, since the collapse of the USSR and the emergence of the, if you like, the nation-making paradigm as a means of understanding the foundation of the Soviet Union, English language historians have both asserted the constructed nature of nationhood in the Soviet context and repeatedly lent on those same Soviet national categories as a way of framing their narrative or delimiting their investigations. There's been an awful lot of really excellent studies of Central Asia regarding national delimitation, cultural construction, linguistic reform, but it slightly swamped our view of things, I think. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, and there are very good myriad reasons to focus on that paradigm. But I felt there was space to analyse something that was subnational, transnational, in the Soviet sense at least, also kind of non-national in Soviet Central Asia. So I worked always from the beginning from the excellent body of work on the foundation of Soviet power in the region, Terry Martin, Francine Hirsch, Adrian Lenedga. But I was trying to do something a little bit adjacent to the making of Kazakhstan or the making of Kyrgyzstan and so on and so forth. So nomadism stood out to me partly as a phenomenon that was managed in the context of Soviet nationality policy and intersected with it, but wasn't of it. It wasn't the subject or the main focus of the delimitation. And nomadism, of course, in Central Asia in the 20s was a building block of identity itself. It was a source of pride for some of its practitioners. It could also be a way of distinguishing Central Asians from settler colonists, imperialists, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, and so on. It also interacted with tribal identities, from what I understand. But it is, of course, a transnational identity. Nomads and nomadic practice were not neatly divided into national groups or bi-national groups, so it's possible to find nomadic practice amongst Uzbeks in the 20s, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and so on. It spanned multiple cultures. Looking back, I think that this whole framing has had an interesting kind of effect on my narrative, which has had mixed results. I'll come back to that later. Of course, saying nomadism was an identity, but not a national identity, isn't really enough. It's also a lifestyle, a form of subsistence, an economic model. Again, I'm very conscious of the fact I'm speaking to Central Asianists mainly today. And the word makes enormous variation in practice. Sorry, the word masks enormous variation in practice across Central Asia in the 1920s, ranging from near permanent migration in some parts, I think, of Western Kazakhstan, to what's properly called transhumance in parts of Kyrgyzstan, seasonal migration, and so on. This is again complicated by the context of the decade, the 1920s, which obviously follows and is followed by periods of intense violence, the civil war on the one hand and the collectivization drive on the other. The 1920s are also characterized by shortages, social upheaval. So that's not to imply that the 1920s themselves were a brief period of calm, because they weren't. All this affected typical practice. It also created a lot of churn in the population. There was a lot of migration that wasn't, if you like, nomadic migration in the 20s too. So I think we need to think of nomadism, therefore, as or at least this is how I've done it, a range of behaviours. I gather from the anthropology that we must not see that range as gradations on a linear spectrum from full settlement on the one hand to nomadic on the other. It's not as if fewer migrations means more sedentary as such. The phrase I come back to a lot is habitual migration. I say habitual because we have to separate out people in Central Asia in the 20s who were migrating under duress because they were fearful or threatened or in danger, and there are a lot of those people in the 20s, from people who were migrating out of choice because it was their way of life. And migration, because I see that as the definitive feature of from the perspective of Soviet statecraft, which is the perspective from which I access the topic. In the book, I quote Nick Barron. I say, for Nick Barron, quote, "Space was a crucial dimension of the Bolsheviks' high modernist discourse and practice," end quote. Nomads were unique for the way that they habitually transgressed in this dimension. So that's my workaday definition, sorted. Okay. So the tendency, that the habit of migration is the thing that made nomads stand out for the Soviet state and frustrated the Soviet state again and again because they would not sit still. Ultimately, I'll do the classic thing here of hiding behind sources for a historian. If you want to access the nomadic story in Russian language sources in central archives, Moscow, Almaty, Bishkek are the ones that I used. It's perhaps more helpful to think of the topic as a series of nomadic behaviors which the Soviet state and the Communist Party had to deal with. Sometimes the party state correctly identifies the phenomenon as features or outcomes of nomadic practice. Sometimes I would argue that it failed to do so, and this really hampered effective governance in the region. But the point is that a lot of my analysis is of governing problems with nomadism at their root, rather than nomads per se. That's trickier to do with the source material available. By the way, one of the advantages of coming to the topic from this angle, I think, is that I was able to salami slice the timeline a little bit differently and avoid getting too involved in the history of collectivization and the ensuing famine. There's so much good scholarship recently available on this topic anyway. And I argue that while the famine is, of course, immensely, irretrievably important, we also learn something new if we disconnect the early 1930s from the 1920s and avoid treating the first full decade of Soviet power as only a prelude to Stalinism, if you like. So if we treat nomadism first and foremost as a series of behaviors as viewed by the Soviet state, what they translate to is a shed load of problems for the governance of the region. That's because of the governing aims and assumptions of the Communist Party, which I'll say a few words about now. And then after I've talked about the mindset of the Communist Party, I'll talk about those governing problems and how they were, how efforts were made to resolve them. Okay. So hopefully now you can see an image from Historia Kazakhstana from 2010, or the image was produced in 1983. Okay. So I'd argue, I'd argue that for our purposes, Communist Party mindsets can be usually divided into three themes. The first is developmentalism or productivity. Okay. The Communist Party's burning desire to develop the economy of the former Tsarist Empire is very well known. So I won't dwell on it too much, but it takes on a particular acuity in the Central Asian context that needs to be explained. So I'll start with this image that I've just mentioned. Note that the image was actually produced in 83, which is well outside my time frame, but it's indicative of the attitudes at work in the 20s, I would argue. So you can see that here we see the depiction of the delivery of the Pervi tractor, the first tractor, right, delivered to a particular community of Kazakhs. And what we see is that it's quite an event. The whole community have come out to witness its arrival and to watch it being used. So the most basic reading of the image is that it celebrates the benevolence of the Soviet state. Here it is bestowing its multiple and diverse peoples with the technology that's going to improve productivity and efficiency, create a new abundance of foodstuffs and other resources, and free people up to spend their time on things other than backbreaking labor. These Kazakhs have been modernized. And of course, this whole use of the tractor is a very common trope, not just in Central Asia, but throughout Soviet culture at the time. There is, however, a secondary reading of the image. I know the quality perhaps isn't brilliant, but if you look carefully at the faces and the expressions and the body language of the assembled Kazakhs, they don't look convinced, do they? Some just seem dubious or skeptical. Some look outwardly hostile. There's a lot of kind of arms folded, right? Some even look a bit amused by the whole spectacle. They think this tractor business is a bit of a fad. I think it's a bit of a joke. So they don't realize, therefore, of course, that the joke is on them. Because we, the viewers and the cartoonist, also know that tractors actually are a pretty good invention. At least this is the Soviet, view of things. They do indeed improve the productivity of farming. So there's a kind of knowing, condescending, maybe even mean-spirited aspect to this little cartoon. It reveals the Kazakhs to be, this is a phrase I've taken from Matthew Payne, production outsiders. So developmentalism works in both directions. It is on the one hand extractive. It seeks to render Kazakhs and Kyrgyz productive. It seeks to make their landscape productive too. It seeks to make their economic behavior efficient. And as I'll come on to, then that behavior, that output can be taxed. But the Communist Party also wants to push socialism into Kazakh and Kyrgyz life, or build Kazakhs and Kyrgyz into socialism. This through the contrast between nomadic life and an imagined socialist life into further relief. This notion that the tractor was new and strange could have been applied to many communities in the early USSR, but I think it was thought of as particularly new and strange to nomads. To develop that idea, let me just show you this quote. Hopefully you can see this now. An extract from a book published in 1928 by A.N. Donich. I quote this whole passage in the book, and I use it very often because I feel that it sums up the anxieties in the party at the time really well. So I'll read it out now. Schooling, libraries, museums, the theatre with its props and scenery, the postal system, the telegraph, telephone, the publication of newspapers, medical aid, particularly in the area of birth control, sanitary conditions, financial matters, the electrification of the aul, the development of industry on a contemporary scale, the use of the majority of domestic implements, beginning with the separator, all this demands settlement and is inconceivable without it. So to me, what is modernity as far as the communists are concerned? What is socialism? There's not going to be any kind of woolly cultural relativism here. For the Bolsheviks, development and progress are measurable, observable, quantifiable, and it's possible to place cultures on a spectrum from developed to underdeveloped or undeveloped. When the Communist Party do this, Central Asian nomads are found to be at the very far end of the spectrum, as far away from the destination of communism as it's possible to imagine. Among all the hugely diverse number of peoples and cultures in the USSR in its early years, only the so-called small peoples of the north or isolated communities in Siberia are considered less developed than our Central Asian nomads. That's why the constant refrain of administrators in Soviet Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is backwardness, odstalost. Note the nature of the connection here in this passage between socialism and mobility or immobility. Donich asserts that none of this is conceivable without settlement. There isn't a consensus on that throughout the 1920s, though I'd argue this is principally due to a lack of hard-nosed thinking rather than because of intellectual disagreement. Nevertheless, you do see here what a critical variable habitual migration is, as is the case in nationalism too. So that's my first component. The first thing I think is important about understanding the Communist Party mindset when it comes to nomads. The second component is nationhood or nationalism. Okay. So here we draw on the now well-known story of the Bolsheviks' national question, which I've already addressed, and their decision to create a union of national republics rather than a formally centralized or unitary state. Why did nationalism sit awkwardly alongside habitual migration? Because the Communist Party, among other things, thought of nationhood as spatial and territorial. So we call it the national delimitation for a reason. Now, I said that nomadism is a component of identity, a very powerful and important one, but for the governing institution of the day, the Communist Party, I'd argue that nomadism isn't formally connected with nationhood and the imagination of key Bolsheviks. Consider, for example, the All-Union Census of 1926, which you can access in full in the Oxford University Library. It's one of the first things I went to look at when I first became a PhD student 100 years ago. I went to look at it thinking that I'd find in this document some useful information about nomadic practice, because some of you might know it's a hugely comprehensive document. And I'd seen Soviet-era anthropologists and historians citing the census when talking about nomadic practice in the 1920s. So I assume the information was there. In fact, there is nothing really about nomadism in the volumes on Central Asia. I did some more digging on the Soviet-era historiography that had led me to the census, and I found that a lot of those scholars had done an awful lot of speculating based on the census material to extrapolate conclusions about nomadism that effectively used, for example, the distance between the reported place of birth of a person and where they were found when they delivered their answers to the census, and asserted that as a kind of migratory, a range of migration for that nomadic person. And the word skotovod, cattle herder, in the census is also useless because it covers all kinds of different practice from settled sedentary farming all the way through to regular migration. So I'd argue this is one example of the peculiar blind spot the party had towards nomadism at this time. So this actually makes perfect sense. If we take the assertion I've just made that nomadism was inimical. Sorry, my 6-year-old is talking to me. Sorry?
Daddy, I've spilled a tiny bit of yogurt, but I'm getting this towel so I can clean it.
No problem.
Tell him my name's Dad.
Okay, I will. Sorry, yogurt on sofas is a major issue at the moment. Where was I? So now this actually makes perfect sense. If we take the assertion I've just made that nomadism was inimical with progress and development, then it would be quite crushing to have one's nationality partly defined by nomadism, right? Because in essence, you're having one's nationality defined by backwardness. And the early Communist Party wants to raise the development level of all the Soviet peoples. The Communist Party, for the most part, just assumed nomadism would melt away without effort. Okay. This means that new nations in Soviet Central Asia need not be mobile. They can have borders, they can have legal regimes, they can have administrative jurisdictions defined spatially. This is not a propitious development for nomads. This is a framework that's messy enough in, if you like, sedentary regions of the new Soviet Union. But in Central Asia, habitual migration is going to cause a hell of a lot of bother once that national map is dropped on the region from above, in a sense. That's a slight, I regret that metaphor now I've used it, but we'll carry on. Okay, the final component of this tripartite structure then, for understanding the Communist Party's governing mentality, is economic class. Okay. This is probably the aspect that's least problematized by habitual migration. There was some flirtation with the idea that nomadic communities might be egalitarian in a way that sedentary communities were not. This fell into the pattern of wider debates in the 1920s about the applicability or otherwise of Bolshevik class analysis on non-Russian or perhaps non-European peoples. But it was only a flirtation, really. Most seem to agree that nomadic communities could be class-based. In fact, the party does develop a class-based analysis for the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, which explains habitual migration. So the Communist Party identified the Bai in Kazakhstan and the Manap also to some extent in Kyrgyzstan as local kind of mini despots who oppressed and exploited their immediate communities. Sedentarization, as it became known, settlement, was said to threaten this stratum of society because it would lead to a greater level of development and affluence, and so break the stranglehold over poorer Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, who are reliant on the larger herds of their despotic masters for sustenance. So these Central Asian kulaks kept their communities migrating to keep their communities poor, and therefore maintain a greater stratification of wealth and retain their power. Whether or not this interpretation is credible, obviously it's not, it's highly contestable. In the early 1920s, there's far less appetite anyway and capability for waging class war on nomads in the Aul. Nationality, I think, takes precedent in a lot of the local decision-making in these early years, but class is really going to come back into this story to huge effect at the end of the 1920s, when of course it acts as a justification for collectivization. The Bai-Kulak comparison in communist thinking does work pretty well. I heard a paper by Kenneth Linden on collectivization in Mongolia in the 50s recently, and he also just used the word Kulak as a kind of touchstone for then as well. I'm quite struck by how widely applicable that kind of basic concept is. So for the rest of the talk then, I'm just going to very quickly run through the four principal ways in which I think the governing problems for the Soviet state in nomadic regions became manifest. If you imagine then that we have these nomadic practices, these nomadic behaviors, mainly habitual migration, and we take this attitude that the Communist Party has and we smash them together, I would argue that the result can be divided up into four. So the first is land ownership and land use, as you'd expect. Border making and border administration, referring back to that national delimitation that I mentioned and the effect on nomadic practice. Taxation and resource extraction, and then social policy. I'm also going to talk very briefly about collectivization if I have time. And then once I've done that, then I'll move on to my conclusions. Okay, so let's start, as I've said, with land ownership and land use. Hopefully you can see the summary of two petitions on the screen, which I'm going to just talk through quickly. So it's often said that, the cardinal factor in explaining the Russian Revolution and the ensuing civil war, and the central important is land. The land question is what provoked so much of the violence and the upheaval in the late 1910s in Russia, and that's true in Central Asia as well. I think nomadic people had struggled greatly under Tsarist imperialism. They had endured increasing waves of settler colonialism. They'd been ejected from the best grazing land, and Central Asians in general had suffered greatly during the violence, of course, of 1916. The civil war intensifies hardship, and parts of Kazakhstan in the west descend into famine. Further, the Bolshevik administration that takes hold in Turkestan at first, in Tashkent, is belligerent and insensitive to local conditions. Moscow is very worried about local feeling, nationalism, anti-Russian sentiment, secessionism, and so on. So the Soviet authority is very patchwork in the region, and so it's difficult to maintain consistency of governance anyway. The Bolsheviks inherit this situation, and their early decisions regarding nomadic land have to be analysed carefully in that context. Some of the most useful sources are found in the archives to assess what happens to land use are petitions submitted by nomads or by Russian settlers about each other. What these reveal is that in the early 1920s, Kazakh nomads began to pasture their herds on land which was considered part of a Russian farmstead under the Tsar. And although the Tsar was gone, Russians still appeared to what they considered to be Russian authority in the new communist era, and the results can be very instructive. So to take the first petition, petition 1 on the screen, in the spring of 1921, one community of Russian settlers near the Kazakh town of Atbazar became subject to a decree about the return of farmsteads to the working Kazakh people. Petitioning for repeal, the farmers placed heavy emphasis on the effort they had vested in ploughing the soil, planting crops over a great distance, only to have that hard work destroyed by nomads who, having heard about the new decree, arrived with their livestock and, quote, boldly allowed their herds to take pasture over the freshly ploughed fields. The Russians' harvest was destroyed, and fearing hunger, they had to flee from the region. In the following year, in June 22, this is petition 2, a group of nomads petitioned regional authorities in Kostanay. These nomads had lost their best winter pasture land to Russian settlers in 1919, 3 years earlier. Since then, the area put aside for the same nomads' summer pasturage had also been seized for the creation of a homestead by settlers. The nomads were left with no place to sow their own crops and hay. They had to seek accommodation with other auls. And once, when they tried to deny the settlers more land, 2 people have been killed in the scuffle. There've been a lot of kind of episodes of violence. The nomads asked the regional agricultural department to conduct an investigation, which they did. They responded immediately, in fact, conducting interviews with local nomads who had confirmed, I'm quoting from the petition here, since time immemorial, the Kazakhs of the region have occupied winter pasturage, end quote. As quoted by the Soviet authorities, they further went on, quote, the Russians considered it their sacred right to occupy our best land, end quote. The nomads had not appealed straight away, believing that their interests would not be protected, and instead lost the battle with the settlers and moved on. But when the Kazakh National Republic is created and this decree was released about the transition of land back to Kazakhs, the nomads decided to appeal to the communist authorities. And they'd had limited success so far until this final event in June 21. What added colour to the whole case is that the department also interviewed the Russians, who gave a very different account of events, of course. But ultimately, this department decided to double down on its original decision and to give the Kazakhs back their land. So it decided to double the cost of land rental payments imposed on the settlers. It prohibited the cultivation of seized Kazakh lands, and it demanded that after the recovery of the harvest in autumn 1922, the settlers had to vacate their farms and homesteads or face forced eviction. This was a partial fulfillment, therefore, of the nomads' request, because they hadn't want to spend winter accommodation in another aul quite yet, and that now seems inevitable. The department also recommended that those nomads with small herds should themselves settle to avoid complete impoverishment. This wasn't enforced, however. Looking at these cases, and these are representative of a much broader suite of evidence you can find, we might assume that localized reactive decision-making would be incoherent and much decided on a case-by-case basis. Actually, they were reflective, these decisions, of legal frameworks being cooked up in Moscow. Or you might say, actually, that the legal frameworks in Moscow were reflective of local decision-making. It's a bit of both. Consider, for example, a decree by the Federal Committee of Land Affairs in December 1921, which prohibited colonization of nomadic land and singled out tracts of Kazakhstan exclusively for nomadic use. Other decrees specified that nomads should have access to water resources or specific types of pasturage. Was this an effort to put the Bolsheviks on the side of spontaneous decolonization, which would happen with or without they say so, or something more supportive of nomadic practice? In a way, it doesn't so much matter because the result is the same. If you take, for example, events on the Ural River Delta, where the Ural River meets the Caspian Sea, there's a mighty argument in 1922 between Cossack fishing villages and Kazakh nomads. In the early NEP era, nomads began pasturing their livestock by the riverbanks. The Cossacks complained that they were scaring away the fish and generally making fishing impossible. And there's an awful administrative back and forth about this. The problem is, to deny nomads access to the delta would contravene Moscow's earlier assertion that nomads should have access to water resources. So we see those problems being created, even though the fishing village is considered a more productive enterprise. They have to govern in a way that's consistent, or they try to. So these petitions reward repeat reading because at first glance they appear to be resolving conflicts in favour of nomads. But now I'm going to bring in this question of nationalism again. Very often the wording of the decision implies actually the decision is not made to protect the nomadic population per se. It's made on the basis of a kind of post-colonial justice to non-Russian peoples in the former Russian Empire. In one or two cases, that could be a distinction without a difference. But if you put it alongside longer-term patterns in the NEP, and if you bring in the question of border making, then that distinction actually is really becomes really stark. Okay. So to focus then on, hopefully you can now see a couple of maps. So if we be more explicit about the nature of the relationship between nomadism and nationalism, that's really apparent when they begin to delimit these new national republics in the Communist Party's kind of map of Central Asia. These national policies had a very peculiar effect on nomadism, simultaneously mitigating the initial impact of Soviet rule on nomads, but also masking deeper, darker omens that by the late 1920s had become apparent. This was clearest at the edges of new national republics, where the deeper incompatibility between the nomadic conception of space and the Communist Party's conception of space was most obvious. In the past, I've written about a couple of case studies in the Western Kazakhstan region. So the first involves the Kazakh border with Russia, north of the Caspian Sea, and the second concerns the Turkmen Kazakh border near the, forgive my pronunciation, the Garabagazkol Lagoon. So we'll focus on case study 1 first. Okay. So in the case of this area north of the Caspian Sea, this is a border that in a sense distinguishes a sedentary culture from a nomadic culture, if that's not too crude a way to put it. A dispute emerged in late 1921 again over two sizable parcels of land between the Ural and the Volga rivers. Astrakhan, which was then part of this larger Russian Federated Republic, asserted control over it, but so did the town of Erda, then part of the nascent Kazakh Republic. So the administrative question from a bird's eye view, or from Moscow, from the center, is a national question. Are these parcels of land Russian or Kazakh? But the problem, as you probably guess, is that in situ, this was an agricultural question. The land was contested between sedentary farmers and nomads. There's an important prehistory to all this that I won't go into now about the organization of the land in the Tsarist era. So this was a very tangible argument about everyday life and practice. It's not just an administrative headache. Moscow's original decision was actually to declare all the land part of the Kazakh Republic and tell the Russians living there to accede to new Kazakh laws or to emigrate out of Kazakh land. This decision is hotly contested. Erda's claim to the land was complicated by the tendency of the Kazakhs in the area to come and go. Astrakhan used this as an excuse to insist that the land was Russian and that the land was also unoccupied by nomads. So the Astrakhan also all the time juxtaposed productive farmers with the kind of chaotic, ephemeral practices of nomads. Nevertheless, Moscow insisted on its original ruling. So Moscow's commitment then to a new national territorial organization for Central Asia had benefited nomads, right? Sort of. If you look at the documentation from a year or so later, you see that in fact more and more of nomadic pasturage in the contested territories was still being encroached upon from the West by Russian farmers. This was illegal. The state wasn't always in a position to enforce its will, of course. It's still tackling, for example, the Basmachi further south in Turkestan and so on. But Moscow's ruling, there's also it's less inconsistent than it might first appear. Moscow's ruling had stated that the land should be within the Kazakh Republic, but it didn't say that the land had to be exclusively used for nomadic pasturage. It might be assumed that the Kazakh authorities would govern in a nomadic-friendly way, and there is some sign of this, but it wasn't always guaranteed. As we know, the ability of the national republics to act and legislate independently of Moscow was quickly and steadily eroded. The Kazakh Republic gradually becomes more minded to pursue its own domestic economic development as well. So local Kazakh administrators, what good are nomads to them if their job is to improve the economic productivity and output of the Kazakh Republic? The Turkmen Kazakh case was slightly more complicated. I'll just move my PowerPoint slide along. Because here we have two notionally, a notional national border between two nomadic cultures, Turkmen on the one hand and Kazakh on the other. Obviously, the border is actually between a Turkestan Republic in the early 20s, not a Turkmen Republic, but the same principles apply, I think. Nomads of the Adai region in Kazakhstan frequently engage with violent confrontations with Yomut nomads from across the Turkestan border. Both groups migrated in and around the Mangoshlak Peninsula and competed for resources there, engaging in tit-for-tat feuds, cattle rustling, kidnapping, and so on. The Soviet state conceptualized this as straightforward lawlessness, not as kind of customary justice or anything like that. But once again, it saw its new national framework for the region as the main fulcrum for resolution. What local authorities did is bring together representatives from both camps, not as Adai or Yomut, or as nomads with mutually incompatible resource interests, but as representatives of new nations. At one point, the Communist Party even had Kazakhs and Turkmen sign a kind of peace treaty in the manner of a diplomatic accord, and it didn't work. There were figures in the party who understood this conceptual error. In the book, I use the work of Alibey Jangildin a lot to provide a view of the region that is both local and also conversant with Communist Party orthodoxy. He and others emphasised the long-standing and sometimes very material causes of conflict in this part of Central Asia. But the Communist Party persisted with the imposition and policing of a national border, which seems to have caused migrating nomads no end of trouble for much of the 20s. I'll just pause here and say that the thing that strikes me most about much of this, not just in the border making processes, but in other case studies as well, is that the Communist Party, I kind of thought, are surely supposed to be materialists, interested in economics and production and class. And yet I think they failed to look properly at the material conditions and requirements of nomadic life. And instead they interpreted many of its outcomes as part of a less material, more culturally based national identity. This irony became particularly palpable when it came to the question of taxation, which is my transition to my next kind of category of governing problems. So hopefully you can see the screen now regarding taxation. Defining taxation very broadly as various efforts to extract resources from the nomadic economy. This is where social categorization and social or economic reality really came to a head for the Soviet state. Initially, there was acknowledgement up and down the hierarchy that the nomadic economy in Central Asia was in a condition of complete crisis following the civil war. So this led to the first tax in kind regulations for the Kazakh Republic being fairly amenable for nomads. You see here on the screen, in spring 1921, officially, cattle herding Kazakhs were supposed to pay between 2 and 8 pounds of dairy product through tax in kind. The precise amount was defined by the size of the community's herd and their location. So Western Kazakhstan, as I've said, was suffering famine in the early 20s, so they were taxed less there. But critically, nomadic rates of taxation for nomadic Kazakhs across the board were much lower still, including a complete exemption for families with 2 or fewer heads of cattle, and an overall reduced rate in comparison to their settled compatriots. Now, stories then come thick and fast from the archival materials about abuses in the application of this and later taxes. Tax collectors tended to be Russian, they weren't trusted by nomads, and would often overlook taxes owed by other Europeans while penalising Central Asians unfairly. But the tax collectors had their own complaints. How do you define a nomadic cattle herder, and how do you distinguish between one family's herd and another? Establishing the precise taxable wealth of each family was near impossible for agents of the state, and distinguishing an aul that was temporarily settled on its migratory route from one that had recently settled permanently really was impossible in many cases for these non-Kazakh administrators. This problem was exacerbated in the mid-1920s when the Kazakh Republic government itself tried to distinguish in tax terms between 3 types of Kazakhs: nomadic ones, settled ones, and settling ones. This was in the introduction of the agricultural tax in 1924. This tax would be used as a carrot and stick approach. Migrating nomads got taxed more heavily than before, settling nomads got taxed more leniently, and were also supposed to receive subsidies to help them establish a farmstead. So they were supposed to get timber resources, for example, to build some accommodation. The Agricultural Commissariat in Kazakhstan was very unhappy with this decision and said it would continue to penalise a more fragile part of the economy and even push some Kazakhs to migrate out of the Soviet Union altogether into Western China, Mongolia, and so on. But there followed very clear institutional anger and frustration between the Agricultural Commissariat and the Financial Commissariat, which felt that excluding nomads from taxation was basically the same as saying that no Kazakhs had to pay any tax, which meant far fewer resources for the state, of course. The financial organs even used the spectre of separatist nationalism to spook the agricultural organs into permitting higher rate tax rates on different kinds of nomads. So again, this nationalist discourse of the Communist Party did not act in the way one might expect. The Financial Commissariat says the reason you want to exclude Kazakhs from nomads is because you're governing in a way that is too friendly for Kazakhs more generally. Another very telling argument made by the Financial Commissariat was that it was only levying taxes on nomads in the way it would levy taxes on other itinerant groups, vagrants, travellers, migrating peasants, and so on. I think this again speaks to a deeper misunderstanding of how difficult it would be for nomadic cultures or communities to transition to a settled form of agricultural life. And that's a precursor to the kind of absurd mistakes made during collectivization. Nomads don't settle in the same way that migrating peasants do. Anyway, after some debates, the newly refined taxation policy once again collides with social reality. What do you do if a grumpy Russian tax collector asks you if your camp is a temporary stop during your migration, in which case you will pay tax, or a permanent settlement, in which case you will pay no tax at all? Obviously, you tell the tax collector you've settled permanently and then migrate quickly the next day before he comes back. The result of this, among other things, of course, was a significant black hole in the Kazakh Republic's finances, not exclusively produced, of course, by this taxation policy, other things too, but it's very visible in economic papers in the following years. Eventually, these arguments about settlement and practice and appropriate national jurisdiction became overwhelmed with growing anxieties about rural class stratification. So this growing consensus that you can identify richer, more oppressive nomads within their own communities and target them for ruinously high taxation becomes governing policy, if you like. So that's where this notion of taxation per se bleeds into later policies of confiscation and collectivization. So we see there the transition then from this focus on, if you like, post-colonial or national justice in the early 1920s to a more economic class-based extractive attitude towards nomadic peoples. They're no longer kind of catching a break from the nomadic, from the national policy, and are increasingly coming under the same pressures as other Central Asians too. And a similar transition is visible elsewhere, for example, as I mentioned earlier, in the management of land. So Central Asia becomes ever more populated with spaces that are thought of as useful beyond simply nomadic pasturage, oil extraction in Western Kazakhstan, the creation of the Turkcib railway, new state farms, and so on. Every time that these policies crop up and these spaces emerge in the late 1920s, nomads get pushed out and out, further out into the peripheries. Okay. I'll very briefly talk about social policy because I know that we're approaching the end of the allotted time. Okay. There's one important point I need to make here. What's remarkable is that, notwithstanding all the administrative headaches I've just mentioned, the party was undimmed in its determination to effect change at the level of everyday life amongst nomadic communities. This area, I think, contains the clearest examples of ways in which the Communist Party was able to and willing actually to accommodate itself to nomadic living, to habitual migration, and to meet nomads in their own land on their own terms. And here I draw quite heavily from the work of Paula Michaels, whose book Curative Powers describes in detail the Red Yurts campaign. Travelling bands of medical experts, veterinary specialists, propagandists, educationalists who migrated around Central Asia in search of a hearing. And their preoccupations involved things like you can see on the screen here: sanitation, animal care, gender roles, literacy, ideological instruction, party membership. Okay. And the Red Yurts weren't the only campaign of this nature. There's a lot of expeditionary efforts made by the Communist Party to reach the nomads in and during their migratory routes. Literacy was perhaps the foundational concern of the party in this arena, because of course, and this is true elsewhere, of course, literacy is elevated to the most important factor that you can change before you can then, flood the region with other texts that will help people live a more Soviet life. But the Red Yurts campaign and these other expeditions, I think, also demonstrate that conviction that I showed you earlier from A.N. Donich, that so much of Soviet life, so much of socialism required settlement, that's questionable. We can push back on that a little bit, because the Communist Party also found innovative ways to extend its influence by migrating as well, if you like. That settlement wasn't always the answer. Okay. I'll just briefly mention that, of course, collectivization in the Central Asian context, in particular in Kazakhstan, has been discussed a lot very, very recently. And we well now know that it caused millions of fatalities across the Soviet Union and especially in Central Asia. It's been a bit of a conversation in English language scholarship recently. Nomadism appears to have played an exacerbating role in the collectivization famine. It intensified the desire among party elites to do something drastic and to do something rapid. Most obviously, this is manifested in Goloshokin's Little October, wherein he argued that the social progress following from the revolution in European Russia had been bypassed by Kazakhstan, and that needed to be addressed. So confiscation and then collectivization picks up earlier in Kazakhstan and eventually hits the population harder. The nomadic economy was also more vulnerable in some ways to this absurd, dangerous, hopeless self-confidence the party had in its ability to conquer nature. The mood music in much of the documentation from the NEP era is this constant argument over whether agricultural or sedentary farming was at all viable in large swathes of Central Asia. I'm sure I don't need to emphasize that the available technology and resources of the time were no match for the particular climatic or environmental features of the region during collectivization. So territory that remained nomadic by the end of the 20s had often done so because it was no good alternative. It was no good for alternative farming methods. And it is precisely in that land that nomads were forced to establish collective farms. Sedentarization, as I understand from the historiography, forced settlement of nomads is really, if I can put it this way, a poorly managed refugee effort rather than a legitimate effort to transition to settlement in an orderly fashion or a systematic fashion. So,
Alan, you can take a few extra minutes if you like. It's fine. Don't rush. We have enough time. So yeah.
Okay. If you're going to give me permission to talk for longer, I will. So to repeat the point I made earlier, then there was a time in the 1920s when nomads were taxed less, when their land was legally protected, when they were supposed to be entitled to water resources, when they were given formal recognition in organs of the new Central Asian republics, when the party was willing to meet them on their seasonal migrations to achieve policy goals. So I don't think it's helpful to assert that communism and nomadism were on an inevitable collision course from 1917 onwards. But there were multiple factors pulling in that direction, not only class and development and the conviction that Central Asia should be developed in the Soviet sense, but also this weird counterintuitive effect of nationalities policy, which gave the impression that decisions could be made to a nomad's benefit, but in fact they were being made to the benefit, as Moscow saw it, of national groups and new national republics who didn't necessarily have the interests of nomads in mind when they governed. So this then brings me to some larger implications of my work as I see them. Okay. It is often said in the historiography of the Soviet Union that nationalities policy and Soviet developmental policy, that these things kind of went hand in glove, that the Bolsheviks believed that by dividing Central Asia into nations, they would expedite economic development and modernization. And by the way, I'm also drawing on a very interesting article that I think came out quite recently from Jeremy Smith about the applicability of that whole idea of a nationalities policy to the 1920s specifically, perhaps in contrast with later decades in the Soviet story. Now, I accept that basic depiction of Communist Party thinking, but we don't always see it in action. We tend to think about it in theory. Nomads present us with a useful case study for assessing the interaction between Soviet nationality policy and economic policy, and actually the picture is somewhat mixed. In the early years of the NEP, it is easier to find examples of nationality policy, as I've said, in a sense, protecting nomadic interests. And that would suggest perhaps that they were kind of inimical to macroeconomic goals for the Soviet Union, because nomads were thought of as unproductive and kind of useless from a macroeconomic perspective in general. The point is, though, that here nationality policy just gave temporary cover for the state's less accommodating view of nomadism. Okay. Where decisions had to be taken and interest groups had to be passed, and nomadic interests neatly dovetailed with Kazakh or Kyrgyz interests, then the state would find in favor of nomads in a sense. But look closely, and even very early on, sort of intranational Kazakh on Kazakh, Kyrgyz on Kyrgyz problems would often be resolved at the expense of nomads and in favor of settled peoples. The party never really misses an opportunity to say, by the way, have you thought about settling? As the decade goes on, we have the national delimitation, we have the creation of the new Okrugi, and eventually we have the discontinuation of the NEP. That national gloss is taken away to some extent. And also the party's ability to really look closely at ground level decisions has improved a little bit. What's revealed is an administration that has no interest in preserving what it sees as the vestiges of a wretched pre-modern lifestyle. And collectivization then turns this disinterest into a kind of active hostility. Okay. I will just quickly cover the fact that I saw, when I was writing up the book, three broader ways of summarizing what's going on here. So the first is modernization, especially if we use modernization as a point of comparison with socialism. That's really apparent from the Donich quote that I showed you at the beginning. The second is imperialism. So many of the processes we witness in Central Asia in the 20s are the continuation, in some cases the intensification, of processes begun under the Tsar. Consider the fate of nomadic passages to the east of Astrakhan. Settler colonialism continued after a brief respite. Finally, though, post-colonialism. I think the driving force for a lot of what we see happen to nomads in the 1920s is caused not by the Bolsheviks' arrival, but by the Tsar's withdrawal. The region is nationalized, as in national territories are created out of an imperial space. New national cadres are created. These national cadres are notionally independent, obviously, in fact, heavily reliant at first and then totally subservient later to the will of the old metropole. These new national cadres are also heavily incentivized and ideologically motivated to raise the prestige of their new national space and to modernize it and to make it efficient and to make it productive, and to do this through social change, putting the local population back on its feet after colonial occupation. In many modern post-colonial spaces, the assault on indigenous practices witnessed in the imperial era is not abated in the name of self-determination, it is expedited with a new ferocity by a state that wants to assert itself. Nomadism is a quintessential example of this. I think this is more than echoes. It's probably the bit of my argument that's been kind of least convincing and most controversial. So it's something I want to develop in the future. What I'd like to do, if I ever get the chance, is to travel to the regional archives of Kyrgyzstan. That's my next point of call. And what I'd like to do is again try to look kind of under the hood and find the least Soviet bits of Soviet Central Asia and start to see if I can build comparisons between early Soviet Central Asia and other modern post-colonial spaces, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. But that's to say a work in progress is an exaggeration. But I will leave it there. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Would you like to stop sharing? Yeah, great, perfect. Before I open the floor to questions and answers, I'll do something which I usually don't, but and just sort of ask, or rather just talk about the first few, sort of responses I have maybe, or even questions. So first is, I look at nomadism and I look at the Mongol Empire, really. So I go back to the 13th century. I don't look at really the Soviet period. But when you were talking about nomadism, I was quite struck by how the understanding of nomadism by the Russians and the Soviets is really part of a much larger conversation about nomadism and how it's really understood in any sedentary sources across time, right? So we have a lot of new work being done by scholars, even in international relations, Newman and Wigan, for example, and some others who've been talking about the importance of sort of understanding where nomadic institutions came into contact with sedentary institutions, and how that had an impact even on the modern day European state, the construct of that sort of understanding, and how that is sort of understood as very dirty, like you said, all the labels that you use, dirty, not modern, backward, so on and so forth. So I wondered how, if you did think about that, how in the Soviet understanding of nomadism and how it fit uncomfortably, like you said, within the modern sort of structures that Soviet Union was trying to create, whether that had similar sort of antecedents to when we look at the European state and throughout history. So is the question, or rather the context then has to be understood in the larger understanding of how nomads are just not understood. So nomads are seen as roaming and migrating, and I like your idea of habitual migration, and I just wondered, I haven't read your book, so I wondered if you actually talked about the sophisticated way in which the nomads over centuries have occupied spaces and moved, and so it's habitual is a good word, but it's a pattern. It's not just something that happens once and then disappears. So that was sort of one quite a large context that I was wondering about. The other bit was when you talked about the nationality policy and how initially it was actually flexible and was responsive in some ways to the nomads. I wonder if partly that has to do with the fact that this space has been connected. So the sedentary and the nomadic civilizations have actually interacted for so many centuries that there is a language that operates. And so that kind of filtered through. And then as time went by the late 1920s, depending on what forces won out, that kind of got, pushed into the periphery. So it's as much about Moscow not understanding or Moscow sort of losing that understanding, but it also within Central Asia, because within Central Asia, you also have nomads and semi-sedentary populations and other populations which have had this kind of conversation and had this push back and sort of pull and push for many centuries. So I wondered if that had any, so I'll leave it at that, and then we'll open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, really excellent points, and I don't feel I can do proper justice to them. But very definitely, I recognise what you say in your first question, for example, about this being part of a much longer term pattern, whereby sedentary communities and nomadic communities encounter one another, and the result is often a mutual misunderstanding, but it's particularly on the part of the sedentary observers. And it reminded me about a lot of the reading and the writing I did during my doctoral studies, which never made it into the book. So much of it didn't actually make its way into the thesis, in fact, about Tsarist era ethnography and anthropology and the efforts that the Tsarist state had made to understand its nomadic subjects, and the way that that learning made its way into communist thinking, just kind of despite the Bolsheviks, if you like, best intentions and their conviction that they would be different from the imperial period. And Vera Tolz is the name that comes to mind of someone who's written a lot about the way that Tsarist ways of thinking about non-European peoples perhaps made its way into Communist Party thinking, kind of whether the Communist Party liked it or not, which makes perfect sense because they worked with the knowledge they had available to them. And as you said, that the structures of that knowledge were imperial structures. They were developed in a Tsarist context. There are interesting differences, as I understand it, between particularly Tsarist ethnography and anthropology in the 19th century and perhaps Western European, British or French anthropology. But a lot of the consistencies are the same. And one of the reasons that never made it into the book, I think, was because I became, or the thesis was because I became concerned, the potential scope of the argument just was huge. How do you artfully and carefully build this story into a much longer story about the interaction, for example, between Russian and Central Asian culture? It's very, very difficult. And I found myself making particularly unhelpful generalizations, about what nomadic culture perhaps looked like in the 20s versus how it might have looked like, say, in the 1820s or the 1720s. So it's there, and it's very important. And I think there's still ample work to be written on that subject. And by the way, I think also that it's also part of that broader effort to make Soviet history less exceptional and to emphasize the consistencies between the Soviet experience and other experiences too. Yeah, but I just didn't feel I had the space or time to do it any justice, really. On this question of, I guess that's very similar actually to my answer to your second question, really, which is, as I understood it, that there is a familiar pattern to the interaction, for example, between Russians and nomadic peoples in the steppe space, for example, which obviously predates 1917. And why should it change? We've got a new flag and we have a new kind of ideology for the state, but why should the immediate interaction between ethnic groups in Central Asia change overnight? Obviously they don't. And something I think I do develop a little bit and talk about is that there is this interesting and constant contrast between the prejudices of the Communist Party leaders, which are still very extant, and clearly they have very little knowledge or understanding of nomadic culture, but they're kind of prejudices of a more sophisticated nature. Whereas then if you encounter Russians and others at ground level in Central Asia trying to manage this new Communist Party state, you know, with very little understanding of what Marxist Leninism is supposed to be and so on, the baser, less sophisticated prejudices about nomadism, which again have, you know, a lineage and have come from decades of past history, are really absolutely there to be viewed. Yeah, so hopefully that's something of an answer.
Yes, thanks, Alan. All right, we have a number of raised hands, but we had a few questions in the chat just when you started. Jahangir Ostonov had a question. Are you here? Is Jahangir here? If you could unmute yourself. Well, his question really was if you knew any works on ethnic processes in the Mavranahar region in manuscripts of the 16th and 17th century. I'm assuming that's before your story. Yeah. Okay. Then we have Ruth Mandel. Would you like to unmute yourself, please? Ruth. All right, shall we move on to Felix and then we'll get Ruth back whenever she.
Okay, I just managed.
Oh,
Thank you.
great. Perfect.
Oh, I was just wondering if he could, if there's time to go on in a bit more depth about collectivization and the different ways that it was carried out, and from the ground up, from the bottom up perspective.
Yes, thanks, Ruth. It's interesting you should raise that because, as I said, you know, there's been a lot of work done on collectivization, particularly in the English language very recently. There's obviously been very good studies earlier on that weren't published in English necessarily. And I reviewed the Kindler and the Cameron books, and one of the things I noticed is that there is this in works that there's this claim that a lot of this was done at ground level by, you know, not necessarily by Russian administrators, but I think that's maybe an area where there still needs to be, there's still a story to be told. Otherwise, my impression is that the collectivization campaign and its particularly acute implementation in the Kazakh Republic, as I've said, it is something that cascades down from the exigencies and the insistence of people working in Moscow. The fact that it then hits the particular social realities of nomadic regions isn't necessarily, you know, something that has been considered prior to that point. But there is that generalized prejudice that I've mentioned before, that this is a region that badly needs to have kind of rocket boosters put under its economic development. Obviously, the opposite effect is had. If you take, for example, some of the examples that I've used during the talk, you see the way that encroachments on nomadic land and nomadic practice, all the kind of the nibbling around the edges of nomadic pasture, is a pretty constant process, and is not done necessarily in the beginning with the permission of people making decisions. That it's just something that's kind of happening because settler colonialism is just kind of allowed to continue for various reasons, notwithstanding some of the laws that are released that kind of declare the opposite. So I think maybe the same premise could be applied maybe to the later 1920s, that there is a ground level decision made as well. But certainly the directive comes from above, I think.
All right, Felix, would you?
Hi, yeah, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for excellent talk. It's really comprehensive. I really enjoyed it. I'm one of the master students in development studies, so coming at from that perspective, it was really fascinating to think of development in that kind of extractive sense, which I really appreciated that you highlighted. And I totally agree about interest in this interplay between nomadism and communism in this sense. So I guess my question wouldn't refer as much to collectivization, which I would recognize is quite recognizably difficult to kind of square off with nomadism, but on the kind of practical policy level, and Prajapati has raised as well that this is a much longer story, which of course I recognize, but on this level, were there practical policy ways in which these challenges could have been managed in a more efficient way? Do you think that the kind of fundamental contradictions of nomadic and initial Soviet ideologies or ways of life were kind of more rectifiable, or do you think this is kind of to some extent an unavoidable clash?
Thank you. That's a great question. I guess I guess there is a distinctive and new governing mentality, I think, in the 20s in Central Asia that is not extant in the imperial structures. An increased level of ambition, an increased level of an increased emphasis on speed, in terms of development. And I'm wondering now whether it's a kind of qualitative difference or a quantitative difference, whether essentially what we have is a lot of imperial, in terms of extracting resources from nomadism. Is it just that the Communist Party just do it a lot more and a lot faster than the Tsarist era? I'm inclined to say that, and I think this is true of patterns elsewhere in Soviet history, actually, it's that conviction towards a kind of universal citizenship that sort of does it for nomads in the end. I think the Tsarist state is more comfortable with the notion that you might have people within its borders who are sort of peripheral and only kind of semi-integrated and so on. Whereas for the communists, you can't have a single person who isn't integrated into the system that isn't a Soviet citizen. Everyone counts. And that sounds like quite a good thing in various ways, but of course, when it comes to having to pay your tax, that's not such a positive development. And I think that so the Communist Party, it is noteworthy. I think what I would draw attention to probably is, for example, in the taxing kind is slightly different because I think they're basically just trying to put something together at a moment of complete crisis and transition. But one of the very first efforts to kind of formalize the tax system in nomadic regions, they are still taxing nomads. It might be a lower rate. It might be more forgiving of nomads who have very small herds, but the conviction that they should be registered and their name should be on the list and they should be ready to pay up if or when they're ready is perhaps something that might be a signature of communist rule rather than Tsarist rule. I'm not sure if that's a very good answer, but that's what I've got.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Just to jump in on that, I mean, we have a lot of information again from an earlier period, from the Mongol period, where taxation was done differently for settled communities and for nomadic populations, and actually they, at least for the Mongols, because they were nomadic, they were accused of knowing far better what to do with nomadic economies than what they did with agricultural economies, except that they used the same local systems that had already been in place. So I mean, the fact that they're different is not necessarily Tsarist. It would probably be something even before that, because there is a sense of continuity since since Muscovite Rus time, who were seen sort of as successors of the Mongols anyway. But of course, they adapted and they differentiated and they learned how to do things differently depending on which communities they were coming into contact with. So I don't think the difference in the way that a nomadic community is taxed and a sedentary community is taxed is something new, or that it only goes back to Tsarist time. I think that's much earlier on. I think what happens after the NEP is that somehow there has to be the same system applied across the board, which then, anyway, that's just.
Can I just add something to that piece as well, which it occurs to me as well. I think there's an element of that in the argument I tried to make briefly at the end, which I still need to work on really, which is that, again, if we're talking about kind of gradations of integration into state systems and the extent to which that imposes economic kind of burdens on people, for example, then we might say that 1917 isn't that break that you think it is, and that it might lead from kind of modernizing practices in the late Tsarist period. I would also argue then that, again, it's that national framework, I think, that again expedites this, because it's one thing to be a member of an empire, it's another thing to be a communist in the Soviet Union, but you're also you're a Kazakh in the Kazakh Republic, and you're a Kyrgyz in the Kyrgyz Republic. And so again, it's a further emphasis on integrating people into kind of coherent political polities that means that they have certain obligations towards the state. So I think that again is something that has that kind of expeditory effect, maybe.
Diana, you had a comment. Would you like to come in? And no? Okay. Are you sure? Okay. All right. Then we have Dr. Pinati. Sorry, go ahead, Diana. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really loved your point about how your stuff from the dissertation didn't come into the book about the imperial part. And I'm just saying that if you ever have a chance to go to Bishkek, a friend of mine, Christopher Baker, who's teaching at AUCA, and he's kind of like a cultural historian, literary historian, and he's doing a fascinating study on that period as well, looking into how the steppe was conquered through the imagination and ordering through the sort of imperial knowledge, and how the two clashed in a way, because the steppe is never fixed, but the imperial forces always wanted it to fix. And they tried to fix it in sort of like, I call it Foucauldian understanding of knowledge, but of course he has his own views, Chris, on that. But I just would love to put you in touch, and I think we really need a project like that. It sounds so fascinating. And thank you for your talk today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right. Dr. Pinati, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to lower my hand in a moment. I have multiple questions, so stop me when you think that I'm asking too much. The first is about something that you say, which I think is very interesting, because it runs really in the face of something that Niccolo Piancialla has been writing about in his book, which I understand is in Italian. And it is about the difference between what is happening in the steppe region and what is happening in Semiriece when the moment of the land and water reform comes. So Nicola has been arguing quite forcefully that in the steppe, one does not see a desire of the state to embark in any kind of counter-colonization, which is the word that Stilnikov uses for Semiriece. So he says, basically what you see in the steppe is that Kazakhs take over the land on the basis of the principle of the land to those who till it, which is basically Lenin's decree on land as reiterated in 1921, while it is in Semiriece that one sees an ethnic marker playing an important role. The petitions that you have analyzed and the response to them seem to suggest that this desire to embark in a counter-colonization, you talk about decolonial justice, is there also in the steppe region. So I would like to hear more about the language that is used, the precise wording that is used here, and also what legal foundation are mentioned for approving these moves by the Kazakhs. This is my first question. The second question is, and try to keep everything very short, is about nomadism as a class marker. So you say that the Bais are considered as oppressors because they keep their community moving, and in this way they prevent them from supposedly living better lives, having higher degree of welfare, sometimes provided by the Soviet state, and so on and so forth. At the same time, though, in the Tsarist era already, the pattern was one in which if you want, the lower level of the backbone that depended on the tribal leadership for access to pasture land were already staying behind in the Kostau. They were sort of hay mowing and so on. And so I was wondering to what extent nomadism is a class marker, and to what extent instead you can have nomads who are victimized by the Bais. Do you see my point? If someone moves around, is he a victim, or he's a victim only if he stays behind in the Kostau because the Bais have appropriated all the pasture land that is available?
Yeah.
Last question is possibly a way to relate your work to Artemy Kalinovsky's. So you talk a lot about the modernization agenda of the Soviet government, which I think is fine, is correct. It's a very important point, and it's very good that you insist on it. But I think you could bring it, you could push it further, and really start thinking about, as Kalinowski does, as a development as something driven by the desire to provide welfare. I think that you link very well together a modernization agenda with a developmentalist agenda. But a lot of the things that, for instance, Donich talks about, these are part of a square welfare agenda. It's about handing out medicines, is about sending children to kindergarten. And the link between developmentalist and welfare agenda is what Kalinowski has said really shapes developmental policies in Tajikistan for a later period, but I think you could argue the same for the period you're considering now. This is more a comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Beatrice. Where to start on that? The prospect of saying something with which Nicolo disagrees is utterly terrifying. I think that you know, I'm loath to put my foot down on this because I haven't really thought about it in regional terms to the same extent as him, I don't think. But I never really picked up, without having tried, on an obvious difference between the way that these kind of land disputes were handled across different regions of what becomes the Kazakh Republic or the Kyrgyz Republic. The only thing I would emphasize is that I also don't really see, I've not seen or looked for evidence of really any coherence that could give regional variation. So it seems to me case by case and quite chaotic. And that means that perhaps there was an effort to distinguish between the kind of decisions made ad hoc in one part of Kazakhstan, for example, from another, but that the kind of predominant factor at play tended to be a piecemeal kind of randomized effort to resolve issues as they arose in a way that was least provocative. So it's not something that's become apparent to me, but again, I haven't looked at my documents with an effort to distill that pattern, so it may be there. I'll be very, very interested to hear more about that. On the question of nomadism as a class mark, and I think I understood exactly the point you were making. Again, I didn't see the Communist Party developing a clear enough theoretical view of class within nomadic communities to distinguish, for example, between different practices. With the exception of, is it Saun? I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but the habit of lending cattle between different individuals in nomadic communities, that was often used as an example of the way that, you know, sort of richer Kazakhs would, or nomads would, exploit the others. But one thing that was noted about the book after it was published was that I hadn't spent a lot of time looking at the more theoretical academic discourse on nomadism that was going on outside of party structures, but also not in administrative circles, kind of Soviet academic discourse about nomadism. Now, I felt at the time that I was really keen to see what was going on, as I say, at kind of at ground level, but, you know, in the bureaucracy by bureaucrats and others. And so it is right, I didn't dwell on that. And I wonder whether maybe it's a distinction between different kinds of thinking amongst different kind of people studying the region, that perhaps some people did think much, much harder about how habitual migration might intersect with class. But I don't think there was that sophistication of thought going on amongst people who were, you know, sat in commissariat committee rooms making decisions, you know, day by day. And then thank you. The Kalinowski work is, I think, a lot about his work when trying to pitch my own and place my own. But I hadn't thought particularly, especially as you say, the Donetsk quote is that perfect example, isn't it, of a different conception of modernization, and it would be a different and interesting way of thinking about nomads again. And I guess it also, obviously, what I did in my talk, I suppose, is contrast the implications of the Donetsk text with the implications for social policy, the red yurts, but actually Paula Michaels, who I mentioned, her work would also fit nicely within that that alternative way of viewing the subject, because that again is about welfarism and support and in a sense improving lives as far as the Communist Party were concerned. So thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely follow that up.
All right, Nafe, finally it's your turn.
Hi, Alan. First, I want to say this was incredibly rich, and not even coming from a history background, I found it extremely enlightening. And I wonder if we could go a little bit more into details about land ownership. So some background about myself. I'm a socio-legal researcher. I do research on law and norms, specifically, mostly in Afghanistan. And one research I've done was on property rights and efforts to create more land tenure. And as your presentation even showed, property right doesn't just create opportunities, but it also destroys, because it's about distributing between different groups. This was very clear when you talked about 1921 and 22. It seemed there's because of the economic policies in place, there seemed to be a strong notion of property rights, where those who held those rights had a strong right to exclude. And so I wonder, first of all, in that period, what were there discussions or ideas about breaking up property rights, meaning like rights of passage, rights of usage of the land, and how that was perceived both from a governance perspective as well as those who might hold the rights? And secondly, from the perspective of nomads, like what was their conception of rights as well, and property in particular, like in the usage of the land, in terms of what rights they should have and how it should be distributed against those who are unsettled? What were their conceptions? And I mean, as you can probably guess, it has a lot of implications for the period, but even the way we understand property rights now and in other contexts. So that's why I'm very interested. If you could tell me a bit more about that.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. I think the first thing to say is that I perhaps didn't emphasize this very much in the talk, but something I tried to make clear in the book, for example, is that what obviously, and I'm sure you appreciate this, what we're not suggesting is that we have a space that containing people that have no conception of property or ownership or rights of land use. And then into that free and open space, that kind of state of anarchy, comes the Communist Party with lots of regulation and red tape and bureaucracy. There are, long-standing customary assertions placed over particular landscapes or resources within a landscape. And you see that, for example, in the competition between what become the Turkmen and Kazakh nomads to the east of the Caspian Sea, that the tribes themselves have a clear sense of what they are owed and what they can use and when. It just so happens that they disagree with each other. And the Communist Party seeks to use lines to delineate land and resources, and that doesn't work for communities that rely on those resources at different points. It's a temporal issue in a way, as well as it is a kind of spatial issue. But the Communist Party sort of doesn't seem to have the kind of the conceptual framework the best place to deal with that at that point. But there are examples of similarly complicated competing claims over land. One of the most interesting ones that I think really crops up in the mid-1920s onwards is that the Communist Party sees it as an opportunity to incentivize certain behaviours by offering preferential access. So wells, for example, and other water resources, if two groups of nomads claim ownership or use of the same spot, then the Communist Party then it kind of intervenes in that debate, and the two nomadic groups often have two options in order to get the best result from their petition. The first is to assert their right over it as members of the nation, so this is Kazakh land and we're Kazakhs and we get this, thank you. Which again, especially in the early 20s, the Communist Party is quite sensitive to that kind of claim. Obviously, that doesn't work when both groups are Kazakhs. So the other one is to say, well, if you give us access to this, we will settle, and we will then stop migrating it and settle up perhaps around this resource. Whether or not that then happens is another option. But you see, they kind of know what's expected of them, and they play that game in the interaction with the state. So that's another way of acquiring kind of preferential access. As regards a kind of broader sort of disaggregation of the space and kind of reallocation and that kind of thing, I don't really have the anthropological or the kind of environmental specialist expertise really to be able to pass this properly. But a lot of arguments that I've seen in the documents are a lot less to do with amount of space and a lot more to do with quality of space. So when a new state farm emerges, in an area that had previously been occupied by nomads, occasionally, the initial effort is to say, well, you can have this bit here, no problem. We will keep our. But the point the nomads struggle to make it again and again is, yeah, but this isn't good pasture land. This is bad pasture land. And obviously, again, Prajakti's made this point. This is a debate, an issue that cropped up long before 1917. So I think that perhaps there's an issue there to kind of bring that back around to the comments you made. There's an issue with the difference between thinking of land ownership principally in terms of space versus use and utility and usefulness of the land. I hope that's something of an answer to your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Jokan.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot, project team. Hi, Alun. Thanks a lot for such a really, really contentful talk. And I have greatly enjoyed. Thanks again. I'm very curious. Once Prajakti mentioned her subject, which is Mongolia, apparently, although of different timing. I am curious, have you ever considered to study Mongolia? I mean, to study in the same thorough manner as you've been doing your research? Because I find it's very interesting to compare the development of that period, particularly in the 1920s, because it's very similar. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they have more or less similar and very comparable stories and cases in this sense. Whereas Mongolia, it's interesting, being allegedly independent, although it practically was at the same, it practically was the same time like the 13th Soviet Republic and the Soviet revolutionaries, especially Kazakh revolutionaries such as Urat Jandosov or Turare School, they took part in establishing this Soviet Mongolia. And I'm curious, it's still, nomadism was very different and collectivization was slightly different because it's still, as far as I know, and I remember from my experience of visiting a decade ago, Mongolia, they still have the population nomadic. And especially it's the Kazakh living in Western Mongolia. Most of them are still continue the nomadic way of life. And it's very interesting to see how it's practically two groups of Kazakh, both indigenous, were developing in a similar, but nonetheless different times. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so funny that you should bring that up because I mentioned this paper from Kenneth Linden on collectivization specifically in Mongolia, and I heard that just a couple of weeks ago and was really impressed and struck by the points of comparison and difference. So I think you're quite right about that. Without having any huge knowledge about the Mongolia case study per se, it struck me that when I was listening to his talk, it seemed to me that one of the kind of salient differences that might have had quite a big operative effect is the comparably fewer non-nomadic settler colonists in the territory, and the way that might have affected the trajectory of collectivization in Mongolia, and the fact they didn't pursue it immediately. And I think the existence of colonial peoples who aren't habitually or culturally sedentary in Central Asia, whilst that other process was going on, was a real kind of a critical and complicating variable that put a lot of pressure on nomadic communities, whether or not the state wanted to apply that pressure. And I think perhaps that's different to some degree in Mongolia, but I can't say that with confidence.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Peter Frankopan wanted to ask a question, but he had to go teach. I'm not sure if he can still hear us. But anyway, he wanted to ask about similarities and differences with other nomad groups like the Buryat and Yakuts in this period.
Right, yes. So I think I'm sort of saying this to be consistent with my own analysis rather than because I necessarily know it to be the case. But I think the fact that those nations, those peoples are not granted an autonomous national republic might be a key difference here, because they're still managed within the larger Russian Federative Republic. And obviously we know that has. It's funny because often I see it claimed that no borders didn't matter internally in the Soviet Union towards the end of its existence, because it was all one state. And yet administrative decisions really mattered, and the distribution of national or bureaucratic jurisdiction really mattered, I think. And so I think the fact that they were within the Russian Federative Republic also played a role. And actually, I think in some ways it might have, I don't know, because it's not something I've looked at in huge depth, but I think it might have again saved them from the prospect of a Goloshokin type figure, perhaps, and not created the same urgency for settlement and development as maybe you see in some of the national republics. But that's speculation, really. If anyone has a different or more informed view, I'd be really keen to hear that.
All right, Montu, would you like to? So Peter was listening, by the way, so he did. Yeah.
Anyway, we've recorded it, so he can, if he was. Thank you, Alan. That was absolutely fantastic talk, and of course, discussion has been great as well. And they've been one of the things that's been we haven't yet talked about, but you addressed it quite a bit in the content regarding the whole notion of the colonizing mission, the modernizing mission, the civilizing mission, and how they intersect and diverge, and what role that plays in today's discussion about the decolonizing debate. So in a sense that what we see from your description and what we know is that the modernizing mission of the Bolsheviks is very much in a sense inclusive, regardless of how destructive or productive it is, but nevertheless remains inclusive. And as you said very rightly about the citizenship, the universal citizenship notion, when we contrast it to other forms of other geographies, other colonial ventures, which tends to be extractive and always remains that, so it creates different category of how we look at the decolonization. So relevance of a lot of decolonizing discussion from other geographies doesn't seem to me an appropriate way to engage with this region because of what you have outlined. And I thought what you specifically thought about that. On a more minor couple of questions I had, one was that you did, it has been mentioned continuously that how Kyrgyz and Kazakh cases are similar, but there are certain differences, and I was wondering what you could say about that. And finally, just one single point. So, you often refer to tax collector as Russian. And I know that's true, but probably not as universally. And I'm sure there is a complexity of who had that agency. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that. So those are the few points.
Thank you. Let me just gather my thoughts. Thank you. Yeah, great points. So there is the emerging, I suppose, and that obviously that dichotomy, if you like, between extractive and, if you like, integrative kind of approaches to the region, I think is really helpful to think along that spectrum somewhere. And I agree very definitely that that emphasis that's been made by a few speakers, about the way that the Soviet state sought to integrate nomads, despite how difficult it often was and how resistant they might have been, is quite a distinctive feature of Soviet rule. And it's not all, to be clear, I don't think, a product of the national framework, although as I've argued, I think that kind of intensifies it a little bit. I think that's also inherent in Bolshevik thinking more broadly. So to that extent, then that I guess is one of the reasons why I'm often hesitant to describe the Soviet Union as an empire.
Same here. This is the point we continue to try to make. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems, I might be wrong about this, but it seems like that it's an emerging consensus, perhaps, that it is an empire. And I guess the point, the obvious point to make is that it depends what you're looking at, But I would agree with you that I'm not sure that's a useful label, and that's why I'm compelled, from what I've seen, to try and build this connection with post-colonial states rather than other empires. So to think about the experience of nomads in early Soviet Central Asia in the context, for example, of new nation states emerging in Central Africa later on in the 20th century, rather than looking to other imperial spaces, perhaps at the turn of the 20th century. I'm kind of inclined to look forwards rather than backwards in that way, because of that integrative quality that it has, which, as you've said, is also very destructive for nomadic practice and nomads themselves. On the question of just quickly, the tax collector stuff, I encounter this problem a lot because sometimes I use the word European, sometimes I use the word Russian. Nothing really fits. There is there's an ethnic, obviously a lot of the people who are employed to do the basic administration, and also a lot of the thinking, actually come from the Tsarist. They're the clerks and the kind of the literate people of the late Tsarist people period in some ways, and ethnically they're more likely, I think, to come from a European background. But as you say, to call them Russian is a bit misleading, and certainly, yes, there are, as with the Red Yurts campaign, there's this really concerted effort to get Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, for example, into the Communist Party and into the administration of their own state, Collectivization and nativization and all that, and that's present. And I think that's part of perhaps where I'd start, where you mentioned the difference between the Kazakh and the Kyrgyz case studies. I think that what's really complicated for pursuing comparative research for the early 20s is, of course, that the Kyrgyz Republic emerges as a discrete place later than the Kazakh Republic does, and that makes a big difference to the way it's governed and also how we can then stick our noses in and find out what was going on. But I think that the kind of overall distinction I would make is that because of the nature of Kyrgyz nomadism and nature of Kyrgyz, if I can call it that, and Kyrgyz society, I think the administrative organs were less struck immediately by the sheer chaos of it all, and the acute difficulty in identifying people, registering them, applying them to a particular place. And I think perhaps there was in contrast, there was more ethnic disambiguation that the Communist Party thought it needed to do in the Kyrgyz Republic, and that made a difference too.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite important. Thank you.
Alan, just on that, just jumping in, I don't know, and maybe I'm just wrong and I'm just hearing this. There seems to be a suggestion that the Kyrgyz or the nomads in general, maybe Kyrgyz and Kazakhs, were not somehow on a census roll or were not part of any documented, registration. But I can't imagine that to be true because that's been, it's been done for centuries. Census taking was big in the 13th century, and then ever since then, it's just nomads have always been part of that in some form or the other. The census was done differently in different places, but one of the things that the nomads seem to have given to the sedentary population is the idea that they have to have a census every other year as opposed to not. because for taxation of agricultural settlements, you have to do that, and they are the ones who really wanted it. So I don't know, do I misunderstand that, or is there something in the sources that points to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think there's two answers to that question. The first is that going back on to the census in 1926, it's an enormously important early effort of Soviet state building, and to be sure, they get everyone on it that they can. But what's the salient information that they think they need to include? If you believe, and it's popular, obviously, amongst really people high up, especially this kind of is teleological the right word? The kind of teleology of Bolshevik history is going to be towards never ending and certain progress. And if progress is sedentary, why bother recording how many people are nomadic? They're not going to be nomadic for long. Pretty soon they're going to settle because the huge benefits of Soviet urban living are going to be apparent. So they're registered to be sure, but the fact of their nomadic activity is not deemed important. Again, I was so struck by that when I first looked at the census. But the second thing to say is that at a ground level, time and again, you see Communist Party committees trying to get them on some sort of register, ad hoc information taking all the time. And I can't remember the exact details now, but I'm sure somewhere I remark on, it's very late in the decade, it's sort of 1928. It's a local, very low level commissariat in charge of a particular region. And they say in their meeting, we really need to find out how many nomads come and go in our region. So they send out an expedition to take numbers, because they just don't know. And I think that's partly, again, this feature of habitual migration. Obviously, it's also to do with the kind of the red hot context in which Soviet state construction takes place. It's rapid and it's under a huge amount of economic pressure. And I'm quite won over by this argument that the fact that it's also forged in the context of the Civil War has a big impact on the long-term trajectory of the Soviet state and its character. So yeah, there's definitely efforts to get them on the roll, but they're either piecemeal or they don't look properly at nomadism as a feature of life.
So do you think maybe the difference is that they're trying to find individuals as opposed to households? Is that possibly something that would that be the difference?
Yeah, they do. So sometimes you see the information recorded by owl, and sometimes you see it recorded by individual. But what exactly makes an owl for these note takers is almost impossible to discern. I confess to have kind of given up on trying to count things, because it was so complicated to try and follow the kind of numerical logic of a lot of party documentation, because they really are struggling. But yeah, perhaps that had never occurred to me, but I think that's probably a great point, actually, that the insistence that they count individuals probably really intensified the complication of the material that they took, and therefore made it in fact less useful rather than more useful. I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't know. It's just, while you're talking about it, I also just thought about how this was the biggest problem that the Mongols had in China in the 13th century. Their biggest problem was that they were counting, they wanted to find individuals and agricultural households, and they just couldn't figure out how many people were in the household, and this caused a lot of problems. So this was one of the first few censuses taken under Monkey in the 13th century. But anyway, that's just
I'll add another complexity to this. So it's not just the person or households. There is also what other information that was collected, and which was found as either useful or problematic. So which was quite common for the nomadic groups to have a kind of a skill set recorded, which, because when time comes to call in, particularly for the military purpose, as to what, are you an archer, are you someone who looks after horses or whatever else. So that information was important, but it was not necessarily important. So when you don't see the right things being asked, you become suspicious as to why are they asking us this? They may have a ulterior motive or whatever else. So there are various other we need to find the census forms or whatever was being asked beyond what we think is census in modern day.
Yes, I'm quite struck. I remember, I think it's in Francine Hirsch's book, Empire of Nations. She talks about how it was revealed that sometimes Kazakhs, for example, would be asked their nationality, and they would give the answer that the census taker thought they wanted to hear, rather than anything that would relate to how they identified themselves. And so similarly, I imagine that would also, how do you report on your nomadic practice or identity if they're that conscious of how the census takers think? And also, I think a lot of them, I think this might be in the Shaikh Metov memoir, The Silent Step, that people who have had to deal with the Tsarist administration encountered the communist administration and they think the same way. That really affects self-reporting and self-identification, I think, on a whole range of different things.
Thank you. Kelly, we have 10 more minutes, so I think I can get 2 more people in and then we'll call it a day. Kelly, do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Alan. That was really fantastic conversation. I'll certainly be following up with you on some things personally that just, yeah, really, really fascinating talk. Sorry, Prajakta, I didn't have a question or anything.
Okay, if you wanted to say anything, that's fine. If not, that's
you can make your
fine.
point. You did in the chat.
Oh, just was a side comment about the question regarding how rights are understood or conceptualized, and was just something I've come across in some of my research, is that I think it can be more useful to approach it from the perspective of responsibilities, and that in demonstrating your continued labor or contributions to certain aspects within a system, then your continued access to it is sort of guaranteed. And so, yeah, the idea or the element of responsibilities, I think, is perhaps useful for approaching the question, but don't know if that rings true to what you've seen in your work. Or
it's very interesting. I guess, could you also, so there's the sense of, which I think is quite a common theme in Communist Party thinking, that you have to contribute to the economy in order to take benefit from it, right? There's a responsibility in that way, and also perhaps I don't know if I'm kind of in that zone of thinking, but responsibility not to break the law as well, which I didn't really touch on in the talk, but there is also the question of whether or not migration and moving around could be conceptualized as lawlessness, and whether it should be thought of as an illegal activity. And the Communist Party also have to bring their sense of what legal justice looks like to bear on nomadic conceptions of law and justice. And a whole swathe of material that I didn't have time to touch on is about migration across the border between Xinjiang and Kazakhstan, which is an illegal thing for as far as the state is concerned, but it's also what nomads there have done for a long time. So they have a responsibility to behave themselves, perhaps, that they habitually do not fulfill.
All right, thanks, Alan. Mark Ebby, you left a comment in the chat box. Would you like to just make the point?
Yeah, sure. I can maybe just elaborate a little bit. I mean, I think on this question of registering the population and what is actually known about the population, and I think it's so important always to consider who we're talking about and what kind of access to what kind of information they have. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that a local organization, in Central Asia in the 1920s would have access physically to, what had to be paper copies of the census, it is somewhat far-fetched to me. And then there's the question, and I'm thinking sort of directly about this right now in my work on epidemic control and public health, as this sort of, in the late 1920s, at least, as the administrative systems are starting to take shape, there's real sort of lack of sort of operational data. Maybe you could say that even if there's a census, even if there's a notion of the population, in 1926, where are people now? What are they doing? Who are they? What's their health status? I mean, even, I'm thinking a lot about northern Kyrgyzstan, and even with the settled population, the public health system, they really don't feel like they have a grasp of the rural population in any sort of actionable way. You know, and part of collectivization is creating a system that gives them some sort of, you know, administrative grasp on the population. And you know, the people I'm looking at mostly are thinking about settled farming populations, but my impression is that, you know, that problem is all the more great for nomadic populations, where you have the question of mobility. So yeah, just this question of sort of how, you know, within an administrative structure, within a sort of diverse set of institutions, who knows what, where, and so on, is, I think, really important.
Just to thank you, I totally agree with what you said, Marek, and it just reminds me of how much I didn't know I don't know what people's opinion is, but I didn't realize how indebted I was to the work of James Scott, for example, until I looked back on my work and thought, wow, there's so much of it in there actually. And the little feature that always comes to mind for me, a couple, is that spectre of collectivized and sedentarized owls having to arrange their yurts in neat lines is just a really haunting depiction of the way the state is trying to impose order on what it considers to be an orderless context. And also something I never tire to tell my students, and they're sick of hearing about it, is how many times I came across documents in the archives that were printed up, you know, official minutes from committee meetings printed up on confectionery paper or wrapping paper, because they just did not have the resources to even record information from their meetings originally. So that the extent to which the information they had is both sparse, poorly recorded, they're poorly resourced. I think that's such important context that is very often, where it's easily forgotten, I think.
All right, thank you very much. I think with that, we can wrap up the session today. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the talk was fantastic, and the discussion was very, very good. So thank you so much for that. And sorry, there are people now sending lots of thank yous in the chat, and I'm getting confused. Okay, all right. Thank you again. I think Montu wanted to announce we have our next, we don't have a talk next week, but we have our annual Central Asian New Year celebration on the 19th. Montu, do you want to say anything about that?
Hold on one second. Yeah. So I'm trying to see if I can. No, I can't. Sorry, I was going to share the screen and make it for people to read, but it's not working. Basically, please note in your diaries. We should have actually put that earlier because many people have left now. We'll have the Nowruz celebration, which we've had for more than almost 20 years in Cambridge every year, but this time we'll be on Zoom. And the date is 19th of March. It'll be roughly between 3:30 and 5:30 p.m. We will obviously send out all the information, but if you could note, we'll have effectively performances from various republics and some poetry recitations and some addresses from the embassies and so on. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. It's short notice, but please do make a note, and we look forward to you. And thank you, and it's been great, and I hope we can continue. So maybe in future we'll have you over here so we can then go for lunch and keep talking afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
So, okay.
Thanks, Alan. And yeah, I think we'll have the recording up and running next week at some point. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Appreciate the comments.